It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Officer Mike Daniels, a veteran cop in his mid-30s, was patrolling the busy streets of the city. His day had been like any other: routine traffic stops, checking in on neighborhood activity, and making sure everything was running smoothly. He prided himself on being a good officer, someone who followed the rules and kept the streets safe. But today, things were about to change in a way he never expected. As he drove through a quieter street near the city's outskirts, he noticed an older woman walking slowly down the sidewalk. She was dressed in a bright yellow shirt and dark pants, and although she walked with a cane, her step was steady. Her face, though aged, carried a sense of wisdom and confidence that Mike didn't notice at first. The neighborhood was calm, but Mike had learned over the years to be cautious, even in peaceful areas. He made a quick decision to pull over, just to check on the woman, as she seemed to be walking a little too close to the street. He put the car in park, and as he approached her, he saw that she didn't seem alarmed at all. She stood straight, her back strong, though her cane helped her balance. Mike greeted her with his usual professional smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Is everything all right?" The woman looked up at him, her expression calm. "Yes, officer. Just out for a walk. Is something wrong?" Mike's instinct kicked in. He didn't know why, but he felt a sudden sense of discomfort. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, her eyes sharp despite her age, or perhaps it was because she was walking alone in this particular area. But there was nothing that suggested she was in any trouble. Still, he pressed on with his routine. "Mind if I check your ID? Just want to make sure everything is in order," Mike said, his tone still polite but firm. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but didn't argue. She reached into her bag and handed him her identification. Mike glanced down at it, expecting the usual. But when his eyes read the name and saw the occupation listed beneath it, his heart skipped a beat. The name on the ID read Margaret Johnson. The occupation listed was Chief of Police, City of Glendale. Mike blinked, not believing his eyes. The woman standing in front of him, the one he had just assumed was a harmless, elderly woman, was none other than the new chief of police for the entire city. He had heard rumors about a new hire coming in to take over, but he never expected someone like her, someone so unassuming. He looked back up at her, unsure of what to say. Margaret's face remained calm, but there was a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Is something the matter, officer?" she asked, her voice still even. Mike stood there for a moment, completely caught off guard. He had just tried to stop the new chief of police, someone far more important than he could have imagined. "Well, Mom, it seems I've made a mistake," Mike stammered, his voice suddenly filled with regret. "I didn't realize who you were. I'm so sorry." Margaret nodded, still calm. "It's all right, officer. I understand. But I hope you remember the rules about who to stop next time, especially when it comes to people like me." Mike's face reddened. He had just made a huge error. Little did he know, this encounter was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would change his life forever. Mike stood there, staring at Margaret Johnson, the newly appointed chief of police, in complete disbelief. His heart raced as he processed what had just happened. He had pulled over the most powerful person in the department, thinking she was just an ordinary elderly woman taking a walk. His mistake had been more than just a minor blunder. It was a huge error that could cost him his job. "Chief Johnson," Mike said, his voice hesitant. I didn't know who you were. I'm sorry for causing any trouble." Margaret remained calm, her expression unreadable. She seemed unbothered by the whole situation, but Mike could sense a certain level of quiet authority in her demeanor. She wasn't upset with him. At least, she didn't show it. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible first impression. "Well, Officer Daniels," Margaret said, her voice smooth but with a hint of sternness, "I understand that mistakes happen, but you should know better than to stop someone like me without reason. We both know the rules." Mike nodded quickly, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He had no idea what to do next. He was supposed to be the one in charge here, the officer keeping everything under control. But right now, he felt small and helpless. He had never been in a situation like this before. "I'll let you off with a warning this time," Margaret continued, her tone softening slightly. "But remember, not everyone you come across on the job will be as understanding as I am." Mike muttered a quick, "Yes, Mom," still trying to collect his thoughts. Margaret turned to leave, but then she paused and glanced back at him with a thoughtful expression. "I hope you learn from this, Officer Daniels. You'll be working under me from now on, and I expect better judgment in the future," she said firmly before walking away. Mike stood frozen for a moment, watching her disappear down the street. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The new chief of police, a woman with years of experience, had just let him off the hook with a simple warning. But Mike knew this wasn't just about a small mistake. It was about how this moment would affect his career. As he returned to his patrol car, he took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He was determined to do better, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a sudden turn. The woman he had just tried to stop wasn't just any civilian. She was now his boss. And from what he had seen in that brief encounter, she was not someone to take lightly. Back at the station, Mike tried to keep his head down, but word about his embarrassing mistake spread quickly. Some of his colleagues teased him, while others offered their sympathy. It wasn't long before Mike found himself dreading the next time he would see Margaret. He knew that she would be watching him closely, and the pressure to perform well under her leadership was now higher than ever. Mike spent the following days reflecting on what had happened. He knew that this was a chance to prove himself, to show that he was capable of more than just routine patrols. But there was one thing that kept lingering in the back of his mind. Margaret Johnson wasn't just his boss now. She was the person who could make or break his career. And Mike was determined to do whatever it took to earn her respect. Mike's first official day under Chief Margaret Johnson's leadership was filled with uncertainty. The morning air was cool, and as he walked into the precinct, he felt the weight of his earlier encounter with her on his shoulders. He had done his best to move past it, but the reality was hard to ignore. Margaret, now his boss, had seen him at his most vulnerable, and he was determined to redeem himself. The precinct was buzzing with activity, officers moving around, preparing for their shifts. But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was a new energy in the air, a level of tension that hadn't been there before. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Margaret's first big move, and Mike wondered if he was the only one who felt a bit uneasy. As he entered the break room, he found a group of officers gathered around, talking quietly. Mike wasn't one to engage in gossip, but today he felt like he needed to know more. He approached them, offering a casual greeting. "Morning, everyone," Mike said with a forced smile. The officers greeted him back, but there was something different about their reactions. It was as though they were all waiting for something. "Have you heard?" One officer, Sergeant Davis, asked, his voice low. "Chief Johnson's already making some changes." Mike frowned. "What kind of changes?" "They say she's not like the other chiefs," Davis replied. "She's all about getting results, no matter what it takes. And from what I've heard, she's been making waves in the department." Mike's curiosity was piqued. "What do you mean, making waves?" "Well," Davis continued, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening, "she's been pushing for better training, more accountability. And from what I've gathered, she's not going to put up with mistakes, especially the kind of mistakes that happened the other day." Mike's stomach dropped. He knew what Davis was referring to. It was the very reason he had been on edge all morning. Chief Johnson had warned him about his actions, and now it seemed like the entire precinct was aware of his blunder. He tried to shake off the anxiety. This was his chance to prove himself. He couldn't let a small mistake define his career. Just as the conversation ended, the door to the break room opened, and there stood Margaret herself, her presence commanding the room. She was dressed in her police uniform, her posture strong and confident. The room immediately quieted as she walked in, her eyes scanning the officers before landing on Mike. "Officer Daniels," Margaret said, her tone cool but firm. "I need to speak with you." Mike's heart skipped a beat. He had expected to hear from her at some point, but he wasn't ready for this. He followed her out of the room and into her office, the door clicking shut behind them. Margaret gestured for him to sit. "I've been reviewing your record," she began, her eyes never leaving his. "You've got potential, Mike, but potential means nothing if it's not backed up by consistent performance." Mike nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I understand, Chief. I made a mistake, and I won't let it happen again." Margaret's gaze softened slightly. "I know you won't. But remember, as a police officer, your actions reflect on the entire department. Your mistake didn't just affect you. It affected all of us. I expect you to do better." Mike's throat tightened as he realized how serious Margaret was. She wasn't just another boss. She was someone who understood the weight of leadership. She wanted results, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less. "I'll do better, Chief," Mike said, his voice steady. "You have my word." Margaret gave a small nod. "I'm holding you to that, Officer Daniels. We all have to work together, and I expect you to rise to the occasion. Now, let's get to work." As Mike left her office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was clear that Margaret wasn't going to make things easy for him, but he respected that. She was a leader who pushed for excellence, and Mike was ready to rise to the challenge. His first mistake had been costly, but now he had the chance to prove that he could handle the responsibility that came with his job. The days after his conversation with Chief Margaret Johnson were tough for Mike. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him in her office. Her steady, unwavering gaze made it clear that she expected nothing less than perfection from her officers. Mike had always been a good cop, but he knew he would need to prove himself more than ever now that Margaret was in charge. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The first week under Margaret's leadership was a whirlwind. She immediately began making changes, implementing new strategies for training and discipline. Mike had never seen anyone in the department work quite as hard as she did. She showed up early, stayed late, and made it clear that everyone, no matter their rank, had to give their best effort. Mike was exhausted, but he couldn't ignore the drive to improve. He worked long hours, paying attention to every detail, making sure he followed the rules and did everything by the book. He also took every opportunity to learn from his colleagues and from Margaret herself. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a mentor, someone who genuinely cared about the officers under her command. One afternoon, after a long day of training exercises, Mike found himself sitting in the break room, sipping coffee and trying to unwind. The room was quiet, and he was alone until Margaret walked in. She took a seat at the table across from him, her usual confident demeanor softened by the exhaustion of the day. "You're doing well, Officer Daniels," she said, surprising him. He wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from someone as tough as her. "You've been putting in the work, and I can see that." Mike smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, Chief. I'm trying my best." Margaret nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I know. That's why I'm giving you more responsibility starting tomorrow. You'll be working on a special assignment, something that will help you grow as an officer. You're ready for it." Mike's eyes widened in surprise. A special assignment. He had always wanted a chance to prove himself, and now it seemed like he was getting the opportunity. "What's the assignment?" Mike asked, eager but trying to stay composed. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "There's been a string of petty thefts in a nearby neighborhood. I want you to work undercover, gather information, and help track down the suspects. It'll be challenging, but I think you're up for it." Mike felt a wave of nervous excitement. This was his chance. He had been working hard for this moment, and now it was here. He nodded with determination. "I won't let you down, Chief. I'll get the job done." Margaret stood up, her face softening with a rare smile. "I know you won't, Officer Daniels, I trust you." As she left the room, Mike sat back in his chair, feeling a mix of pride and anticipation. This assignment could make or break him, but he was ready. The next few days were going to test everything he had learned so far, but he wasn't afraid. He had spent too long proving to himself that he could handle the pressure, and now it was time to show everyone else. The next morning, Mike suited up for the undercover operation. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make a difference. This was his chance to step up, to prove that he could be the officer that Margaret and the rest of the department could count on. He took a deep breath as he looked in the mirror before heading out. "Time to show them what I can do," he muttered to himself. The journey was far from over, but Mike knew one thing for sure. He was ready to rise to the challenge. The next morning, Mike walked into the precinct, feeling a new sense of purpose. Today was the day he would prove himself. Chief Margaret had trusted him with a special undercover assignment, and he couldn't let her down. The case seemed simple enough at first, petty thefts in a nearby neighborhood. But Mike knew it could be much more complicated than it appeared. He had been on enough cases to understand that things were rarely as straightforward as they seemed. Margaret had given him all the details he needed: a few suspects, a pattern of stolen goods, and a general area where the thefts were happening. But there was one thing she hadn't told him: how far this investigation might go. He couldn't afford to overthink it. He had to stay focused. Mike spent the morning gathering information. He spoke to neighbors, took notes on the locations of the thefts, and tried to find any connection between the victims. So far, there didn't seem to be any obvious links. The victims were from different walks of life, and their stolen items didn't share any common thread. But Mike's instincts told him that there was something deeper at play. By mid-afternoon, Mike was starting to feel the pressure. He'd always been good at blending in, but this undercover work was different. It wasn't just about wearing a disguise and gathering information. It was about gaining the trust of the people he was investigating. He needed to be careful. One wrong move, and he could blow the entire operation. He spent the next few days in the neighborhood, slowly earning the trust of the residents. He spoke to shop owners, helped carry groceries for elderly neighbors, and even spent some time talking to the local kids. They all seemed to know him as Mike, the friendly new guy who was just looking to help out. He kept his real identity hidden, of course. The last thing he wanted was to raise any suspicions. One evening, while sitting at a local diner, Mike overheard a conversation that caught his attention. Two men sitting at the counter were talking in hushed voices, their words barely audible above the clatter of silverware and the hum of the restaurant. They were talking about recent business in the neighborhood. Business that didn't sound like it had anything to do with legitimate work. Mike's ears perked up. He hadn't expected to hear anything so soon, but it seemed like his instincts were right. These men were connected to the thefts. He didn't have enough to act yet, but he could feel that he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. The next day, he followed the two men at a distance, trying not to be noticed. They went to a rundown building on the edge of the neighborhood, a place Mike had heard rumors about, but never thought he'd have a reason to investigate. The building was quiet, and no one seemed to be around. Mike knew that he was at a crossroads. He could approach the building and risk getting caught, or he could turn back and report his findings. But Mike wasn't one to back down now. He had come this far, and he couldn't stop now. He decided to take the risk. As he approached the building, he made sure to stay out of sight, moving quickly and quietly. His heart raced, but he was focused. He had to find out what was happening inside. Just as he reached the door, he heard footsteps behind him. Mike froze, his breath catching in his throat. Had someone spotted him? He turned around, ready to defend himself, but when he saw who it was, he couldn't believe his eyes. Standing behind him was Chief Margaret Johnson. She had been keeping a close eye on his progress, and now, it seemed, she was ready to step in. "You're doing well, Officer Daniels," she said with a smile, though her voice was low, so as not to alert anyone inside. But I think it's time we wrap this up together. Mike turned around in surprise, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing behind him, watching him with a calm but intense expression, was Chief Margaret Johnson. Her presence was as commanding as ever, and for a moment, Mike wasn't sure what to say. He had been working undercover for days, trying to piece together the puzzle of the neighborhood thefts, but now he found himself face to face with his boss, the person who had set this entire mission in motion. "Chief," Mike asked, his voice a mix of confusion and respect. "What are you doing here?" Margaret smiled slightly, her eyes scanning the rundown building ahead of them. "I've been keeping track of your progress, Officer Daniels. You're doing good work, but I think it's time we move in together." Mike's mind raced. He hadn't expected the chief to be so involved in this investigation. He had been operating under the assumption that he was working alone, with only occasional updates from her. But now, it was clear that Margaret had been following his every move, quietly overseeing his work. He couldn't deny that he was grateful for her support, but a part of him also felt uneasy. This was a big step, more than just an ordinary assignment. If things went wrong now, there would be no one to blame but themselves. "Are you sure this is the right time?" Mike asked, his voice careful. "I've been gathering information, but I don't have enough to make an arrest yet. We don't know who's behind this." Margaret nodded, understanding his hesitation. "You've done well so far, Mike, but this is what we've been waiting for. We can't afford to let this drag on any longer. These thefts are part of something bigger, and we need to act before it escalates." Mike felt a surge of determination. He trusted Margaret completely, and her words gave him the confidence to move forward. Together, they could solve this case. "I'm ready, Chief," Mike said, standing up straighter. "Let's do this." Margaret's smile widened. "That's the spirit. We'll move in quickly, but carefully. I'll take the lead, and you'll cover me from the back. We've got this." With a shared understanding, they made their way toward the building. Mike's heart raced as he followed Margaret's lead, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another assignment. It was his chance to prove himself, not just as an officer, but as someone who could work under the guidance of a leader like Margaret. As they approached the building, Mike noticed the tension in the air. There was something about the place. It looked abandoned, but he could feel the presence of activity inside. They moved quietly, careful not to make a sound. Margaret's training had prepared her for moments like this, and Mike did his best to match her movements. When they reached the door, Margaret paused, signaling for Mike to stay back. She approached the door slowly, checking for any signs of movement inside. She turned to Mike, her expression serious. "Get ready," she whispered. "We're about to uncover the truth." With a deep breath, Mike nodded, his nerves steeled. They were about to confront whoever was behind the thefts, and whatever happened next, he knew they would face it together. Mike's heart raced as he stood in the shadows, watching Chief Margaret Johnson carefully assess the situation ahead. The tension in the air was thick, and he could feel the weight of the moment. They had come this far, and now it was time to confront the criminals responsible for the thefts in the neighborhood. He trusted Margaret completely, and he knew she had a plan. Still, Mike couldn't help but feel the pressure. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Margaret gave him a quick nod, signaling that she was ready. The plan was simple but dangerous. They needed to enter the building quietly, find out who was behind the thefts, and gather as much information as possible. They couldn't make a mistake. As much as Mike had been preparing for this moment, nothing could fully prepare him for what was about to unfold. Margaret moved first, and Mike followed closely behind. They approached the building, the night air cool and silent around them. Every step felt louder than the last, but they stayed focused, working in perfect sync. Margaret's experience as a leader in the department had already proven to be invaluable, and Mike felt himself growing more confident with each step. They reached the door, and Margaret gave Mike one last look. "Stay sharp," she whispered. "We're going in." The door creaked as Margaret pushed it open. Mike followed her inside, his eyes scanning the dark room. The inside of the building was dimly lit, with old furniture scattered around. It looked like a storage space, but there were signs of recent activity. Boxes piled high, a few open crates, and tools scattered across the floor. Mike's instincts told him that they were getting close to something big. They moved deeper into the building, careful not to make any noise. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Mike's senses were on high alert. He had been in tight situations before, but this was different. Margaret was leading the charge, and he had to trust that she knew exactly what she was doing. As they turned a corner, they saw two men talking quietly in the back of the room. The moment they saw the officers, the men froze. Mike's heart skipped a beat as he realized they had been spotted. But before anything could happen, Margaret was already in motion. "Police, don't move," she shouted, her voice commanding. The two men looked at each other, clearly panicked, but neither tried to run. Instead, they stood frozen in place, realizing they were caught. Mike quickly moved in, handcuffing the first man while Margaret secured the second. They worked in perfect harmony, their experience showing as they efficiently subdued the suspects. Mike couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline as they arrested the men. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. As the officers led the criminals out of the building, Mike looked at Margaret, a sense of accomplishment settling in. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Margaret smiled, her eyes proud. "You did well, Officer Daniels. You kept your cool, and you followed through. This is what being a good officer is all about." Mike couldn't help but grin. The past few days had been intense, but he had learned so much from Margaret. He had earned her respect, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his career. As they drove back to the precinct, the city lights twinkling outside the window, Mike knew this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, but with Margaret by his side, he was ready for whatever came next. Together, they had taken down a dangerous criminal ring, and they had done it with determination and teamwork. Mike had proven to himself, and to Chief Johnson, that he was ready for anything.